Okay, this video is a book review, and here is the book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It was written by Edward Gibbon. And now this book is considered a work of genius, and he was called one of the greatest historians. You can see this painting right here is by Thomas Cole from about 1832. He was part of the Hudson River School, perhaps the greatest landscape painter who ever lived. And this painting is from a series of paintings called The Course of Empire. So an empire starts out with these proud, pastoral, rural people, and then they're strong and they're brave, and then they're also very religious. And then over time they become corrupted and decadent, and they lose their religion. And as they lose their religion and become decadent, they no longer are adhesive and stick together. And then another group comes in and conquers them and destroys their civilization. That's also, Vico Giambattista, the cycle of civilization. This is a well-known thing, and it's something that hopefully is not inevitable in the USA, even though there's a lot of parallels to the current sort of decline of the USA with the decline of the Roman Empire. Okay, and now here's a picture of Edward Gibbon. He was a fat guy. He's quite rich, independently supported, so he had a lot of time. He went on a vacation to visit Rome, and he saw the incredible buildings like the Colosseum, and he asked himself, how could such a magnificent civilization have collapsed? It had total power over the whole world. What could have brought it down? And he was curious about that question, and he was a very studious guy, and he is a very bright guy. He's a little bit pompous, of course. He's sort of an English, Protestant, atheist type of guy. The other thing, too, about this book is he spent way too much time always simply going through history from the point of view, who was the current emperor, and then how did the next emperor take power? There's a lot of other things interesting to talk about in Rome. He could have talked about Cicero, about Quintilian, about Marcus Aurelius, about some of the smarter, more interesting Romans. But instead, it was pretty much almost most of the book was just focused on all these empires, all these emperors. And he focused more on the bad emperors than the good ones and all their corruption and their brutality, which, was kind of boring, okay? It's 1,000 times more interesting to read about the ancient Greeks. They're so intelligent and interesting and creative than it is to read about the ancient Romans. But be that as it may, I'll share with you some of his insights and quotes. And, I read sort of an abridged version of it, an audiobook, and I had taken courses in his work as before. And by the way, my father's from Ireland, so Irish people were not that thrilled. Some English Protestants sitting there, saying that Catholicism isn't that great. He blamed some of the fall of the empire on Catholicism. Okay, so what are the pros of the book? Very elegant language. He's very articulate. And just a typical thing he would say, freedom is the happy parent of taste and science. The fire of genius was extinguished by such and such. The only quote that I saw on Cicero was, Cicero enabled Rome to rival Athens for oratory. And then after the victory at Actium, every big decision depended on Augustus. Okay, so let's see. History is little more than the register of crimes, follies, and the misfortunes of mankind. A barbarian is a man uncivilized, untaught, a savage. According to Gibbon, savages were men still living in the hunter-gatherer phase. Barbarians were typically illiterate peoples who alternated between pastoral farming, drunkenness, and plundering other people. Okay, Gibbon continues. The educated man, by reading and reflection, multiplies his own experience and lives in distant ages and remote countries, whilst the illiterate is rooted to a single spot and confined to a few years' existence, surpasses but very little his fellow laborer, the ox, in the exercise of his mental faculties. And then, Martin Luther said almost exactly the same thing. And in the past, you had more separation of the classes. You had an aristocracy, and you had all the illiterate peasants. And because the aristocracy was just, for the most part, talking to each other with their books, they would say whatever they wanted about the poor. Okay, so you get a much more outspoken opinions in these books. It's partly what's interesting about them. What I find interesting studying ancient Rome is that nobody has a dog in the fight. So you can see how people really behave in political situations without anybody feeling they have to defend their own co-ethnics or anything. What was bad about the book? Like I said, too much time just spent on, why did emperors die, and then how did the next one take power? And all the interesting stuff about Rome. I would have liked to hear about Epictetus, the Epicureans, and the origins of Christianity. All that stuff would have been more interesting. So I thought this book was quite overrated. It's worthwhile to go through his quotes, but it wasn't that much fun to read. It's easier to read than Milton, but that's not saying much. The way to read Paradise Lost, by the way, is to have sort of a modernized version of it, to translate it almost. Okay. He finished this book in 1776, which is kind of funny because that's when the English Empire began to fall as well, with the USA asserting its independence. Okay, more quotes by Edward Gibbon. Every man who rises above the common level has received two educations. The first from his teachers, the second, more personal and important, from himself. Yeah, that's true too. If you just go to school, even if you get A+ and everything, you're still really not that well educated. Real education comes from trying to answer questions on your own, being curious about stuff. And that's what you really remember, and that's what makes a person unique and interesting. By the way, I was recently talking to an internal medicine doctor, and he was telling me about how smart this one internal medicine guy is. And I know the guy. The guy's real bright. He's almost like he swallowed a dictionary. He can repeat everything back from the textbooks. But I also know the guy, and I know his work. He never does anything interesting or controversial or unusual. He's just sort of a prodigy, almost like a puppet. He knows conventional medicine and what it wants. And that's nice, but the reality is it misses out on the most important things, so you really can't do much. And it doesn't matter if you're A++ in conventional medicine, you still don't know nutrition, epidemiology, toxicology, and the things that start with the letter S, so you don't know much. It's just a fact. That's why, a health coach who studied, videos at my YouTube channel for a month knows more than the chief of internal medicine at Harvard. Okay, Gibbons continues. If man were called to fix the period of history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, he would without hesitation name that which elapsed from the death of Domitian to the accession of Commodus. So Commodus was the son of Marcus Aurelius. If you ever see the movie Gladiator, you can see the accession to power where Commodus took over. It was almost like inadvertently Commodus took over according to the movie, rather than Russell Crowe, who would have been better. He was the great gladiator. Okay, Edward Gibbon. The various modes of worship which prevailed in the Roman world were all considered by the people as equally true, by the philosopher as equally false, and by the magistrate as equally useful. And thus toleration produced not only mutual indulgence, but even religious concord. Okay, and that's a little bit like typical Edward Gibbon. He's clever, he's a little bit funny, but he's also sort of insulting towards religion. It's religion which holds a society together. What does it mean? Relegare, to ligate, to tie together a people. The Christian persecutions included Nero and Diocletian. The Christians were blocked from jobs. Christian slaves were told that they would never be allowed to be freed by Diocletian. Lots of Christians were martyred. Okay, and that's another thing too. There's a lot of great books written about the early Christians. My favorite is Quo Vadis, but there's a whole bunch of good movies and books about them. There's Ben-Hur. There's a lot of good stuff about them. Okay. Quo Vadis is one of the greatest novels ever written. Probably about the fourth best novel ever written, by Henry Sienkiewicz, a Polish guy. Okay, typical, though, here's like the eloquence of Gibbon. This is the thing you like. You say, the vices of Maxentius made the virtues of Constantine more lustrous. So he has a lot of clever sentences like that. Constantine ruled from 312 to 337 AD, and he sort of popularized Christianity, made it legal, and then you saw a whole bunch more Christian Catholic churches pop up. Oh, got to get back to that slideshow. Got to go. Okay, here we go. The voice of history is often little more than the organ of hatred or flattery. There's truth in that. And he's one to talk. He's rather anti-Catholic, okay? After the sack of Rome by Alaric the Goth, Rome and the Western Empire continued to decline. Yeah, Alaric the Goth was a badass. And Rome just, kept falling apart and becoming weaker, more feminized, more stupid. The center of Western civilization had long since moved to the Eastern Roman Empire, run out of Constantinople. And the Eastern Roman Empire reverted back to having Greek as its primary language. The Eastern Roman Empire was proud of its Greek heritage. The New Testament was written in Greek. A lot of the best things in Western civilization, they come from the ancient Greeks. That's also why if you ask me about Catholicism, and even though it's called Roman Catholicism, I actually think it owes a tremendous amount of its structure to the ancient Greeks. Nietzsche had said that Christianity was basically Platonism for the masses, okay? And then Aquinas had basically said, we can build on the structural thought of Aristotle. And as a matter of fact, I would look at Christianity as two main strains: the Aristotelian strain that runs through Aquinas and the Renaissance, and then the Platonic strain that runs through Augustine to Luther and the Reformation. Okay. All right, Edward Gibbon continues. The Catholic Church denounced Calvin, but made a saint of Augustine, even though it's difficult to tell their arguments apart, even with a theological microscope. Yeah, well, I think that's also misleading. He's trying to pretend they're not that different. There's actually, Augustine was a much better person than Calvin. Calvin had been described as Lenin by other theologian historians. Okay. As Jacques Bourzoon had said, Calvin was like Lenin, evil. And Calvin was a destroyer of art, man. He was a big jerk. Christianity arose out of the Old Testament, Greek philosophy. Also, the Eleusinian Mysteries had a bit of influence. Stoic philosophy, pagan traditions like Sol Invictus, the sun god of Rome, and the teachings of Jesu Christus. Okay. Edward Gibbon. Persuasion is the resource of the feeble, and the feeble can seldom persuade. Augustus was sensible that mankind is governed by names, nor was he deceived in his expectation that the Senate and the people would submit to slavery, provided they were respectfully assured that they still enjoyed their ancient freedom. Yeah, most people are like that. They don't really care about what reality is, as long as they get a nice title or something like that. All right, so anyways, that's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon, and there's a couple interesting things to it. I think the concept of the cycle of Vico, Giambattista, is most useful in those paintings by Thomas Cole. Hope that was interesting.